evening, good morning, afternoon, wherever you might be. We'll just give it a few seconds for everyone to file into the webinar, and then we'll start. Okay, maybe we'll get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Ali. I'm a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm joined today by colleagues at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. Today's webinar, which is hosted by the Master of Health Research Ethics training program, which is a collaborative master's training program currently offered by our two institutions, Johns Hopkins and University of Malaya. Just a little bit of further information about the program before we begin today's webinar with our speaker. The program is a one-year full-time master's degree program. It's currently inviting and accepting applications for the next cohorts of students, and there are scholarship opportunities available with support and funding from the U.S. National Institutes of Health Fogarty International Center. So very much interested in inviting colleagues from the region, Southeast Asia in particular, to submit applications if there's interest, and we can put an email address and contact in the chat for anyone who is interested in learning more about the program. But it is a one-year full-time training program with some online and in-person training activities. So that's just a little bit about our collaborative master's program. And without further ado, I think I'll now switch gears and introduce today's webinar. So as many of you are very familiar by this point, this will be a webinar where you can post questions in the chat or the Q&A. At the bottom of your screen. We will take your questions in turn at the end of the presentation, which will be about 30-40 minutes long, and we'll take each question in order of appearance. The session is being recorded and will be posted online on the Master of Health Research Ethics and Berman Institute of Bioethics websites. And we'll post a link in a moment to those websites where you'll be able to find both the webinars from the past couple of years, as well as this recording. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague at the University of Malaya, Professor Adiba Kamarulzaman, who's one of the principal investigators on the training grant that I just mentioned for an introduction of our speaker today. So Adiba, over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for this final event for the Moratorium Hot Topics, Professor Julian Savulescu, also a Monash alumni, who is going to speak to us on ethics of gene editing and gene selection. And as you can see from the screen there, Julian is currently the Chen Su Lan Professor in Medical Ethics at the NUS, as well as Director of Center for Biomedical Ethics at the NUS as well, and holds several visiting professorships at various other academic centers in Australia. His research interests, as you can see there, is in medical ethics, especially ethics of new biotechnologies and ethics of genetics, which you'll hear about tonight, AI, and practical ethics and philosophical bioethics. So over to you, Julian.
Thanks very much, Adiba. It's a great privilege to be here with you all tonight. And so I understand this course is on research ethics. And when people think about research ethics, they often think of kind of hurdles that that ethicists or ethics committees put in front of researchers, and how ethics is needed to constrain certain practices. And I want to talk tonight about how ethics can facilitate research and enable research to be done, and have a more positive, constructive approach to ethics. And I actually did medicine with Adiba, and I left medicine because I was so excited about philosophy and the possibility of philosophy dealing with the most difficult questions in medicine. So I want to try to also illustrate how philosophy can enable us to make progress in research ethics. So you're all familiar with the gene editing scandal involving He Jiankui, where he produced at least 2 babies, Lulu and Nana, who were gene edited to make them resistant to HIV. He modified the CCR5 gene. There's also probably another birth and possibly others. And at the time of this experiment, I issued this press release, which essentially said that this was unethical because he had exposed normal children to risks from gene editing for no necessary benefit, and the risk of off-target mutations wasn't balanced by any particular benefit to these children because there were other ways of preventing HIV. For example, employing protections during sex or not having contact with the bodily fluids of people with HIV. So, in fact, it's a lot more complicated than that. We don't have time to go into now, because what he also did was offer sperm washing and antiretroviral therapy to HIV discordant couples to enable couples where the male had HIV and the female didn't, to have a child who wouldn't be infected with HIV. And my understanding is that those measures weren't ordinarily available in China. So there are complicated questions around the non-identity problem, which I'll discuss briefly later, about whether these children would or could possibly have existed were it not for the experiment he conducted. But the simple analysis of this piece of research was that it exposed 2 future children, at least 2 future children, to unreasonable risks. And actually what He Jiankui did was repeat a mistake that I wrote about when I first took over as the editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics in about 2000, where a young man, Jesse Gelsinger, died during a gene therapy trial. So Gelsinger was an 18-year-old man with a mild form of a genetic disorder, which was able to be managed by diet and drug treatment. And at that time, he was offered the opportunity to take part in a somatic gene therapy trial by James Wilson, the leader in gene therapy at one of the most prestigious institutes in the world, using an adenovirus vector. And he died 4 days after the gene therapy was administered. And this led to the Institute for Gene Therapy being shut down. It was a huge scandal at the time. And at the time, there was a question of whether the study should have been done using not adults with the mild form of the genetic disorder like Gelsinger, but newborns with the severe version, which was lethal early in life. And so there was a discussion about whether to construct the trial to test the gene therapy on infants who would otherwise die, or on adults like Gelsinger who would not otherwise die. And again, to put it simply, the justification for using adults was that there are inevitably risks with anything, and especially a novel gene therapy. And because the risks are significant, it's better that the trial be conducted on humans who can consent rather than those who can't consent for themselves. And in fact, the Declaration of Helsinki says exactly that, that when you have the choice of conducting a trial on either adults or children, you should prefer adults who can consent. So what I'm going to argue now is that this prioritized consent over harm, because Gelsinger stood to lose a whole essentially normal life, roughly 70 years of normal life, by dying, whereas a severely affected newborn, if that newborn died, it would lose months or perhaps a year or two of life. So the expected harm prior to conducting the research is the probability of the harm multiplied by the magnitude. And because the magnitude of the harm is so much greater in Gelsinger's case, the expected harm was much higher. Even more, there was no benefit to Gelsinger, whereas there was a potential benefit to an affected newborn who would otherwise have died. So I don't think there's any good reason to prefer more harm to less harm, regardless of whether someone's prepared to consent to that. So in my view, it was a mistake to conduct the research on Gelsinger. So, I described this concept of expected harm, and we can minimize the expected harm from research by choosing participants with the shortest life expectancy, the lowest probability of survival, and the poorest quality of life. And all of these factors would have pointed towards selecting the newborns over Gelsinger. You can put figures on this, and you can see that it's orders of magnitude greater expected harm employing an adult. In fact, He Jiankui referred in a video before it was taken down off the web, where he was discussing the ethics of his research, and said we must never repeat the mistakes of Jesse Gelsinger. And in fact, he did exactly that, because what he did was take normal embryos with a normal life expectancy like Gelsinger and expose them to a risk of genetic mutations, malformations, cancer, premature death, when he could have taken embryos with severe lethal genetic disorders, like the newborns in the OTC deficiency case, who should have been used instead of Gelsinger. So I could have actually defended He Jiankui's research if he'd taken embryos that were not normal, but that were destined to die as appropriate candidates for first-in-human gene editing. And other people also cottoned on to this idea that he had employed the wrong target. So George Daly, the dean of Harvard Medical School, said following Gelsinger's press release that he should have used patients with Huntington's disease or Tay-Sachs disease, embryos with Huntington's disease or Tay-Sachs disease, that might have been averted only through gene editing. And so people talked about a translational pathway employing embryos with genetic disorders first. But again, this is sort of only half correct. George Daly hasn't quite grasped this concept of expected harm, because in Huntington's disease, the individual has 40 good years that they stand to lose if the gene editing is lethal or severely life-shortening. Whereas embryos with Tay-Sachs disease, those individuals will die in the first few years of life. So in fact, it should be done on embryos with Tay-Sachs disease and not embryos with Huntington's disease, because the expected harm is less. So on the basis of this, I propose what I call a 5-stage translational pathway for gene editing that starts with minimizing expected harm and taking embryos with lethal conditions that will kill them early in life, where they stand to lose very little and also stand to gain a lot. And if it's shown to be safe in say, Tay-Sachs disease, you could then move to more to less severe conditions, but conditions which nonetheless undermine the very elements that make life as a human being worth living. So severe genetic disorders that manifest from the moment of birth. And if it was shown to be safe there, you could then move to cases where there is greater potential expected harm and also comparatively less benefit. So in this point, Huntington's disease would be a candidate. And then if it's shown to be safe in that group, you could then finally move to conditions where there is avoidable serious risks, such as resistance to HIV. So if we had a vaccine for HIV that was sufficiently safe, of course it would be employed on children. And if gene editing was sufficiently safe, passing through these previous 3 tiers, it would be reasonable to treat gene editing just as we treat vaccination. In fact, He Jiankui described it as genetic vaccination. But more importantly, we would also, at that point, it would be reasonable to consider polygenic editing to reduce the probability of diseases like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so on that most of us will experience. And finally, it would be ethical, if it was safe in those previous 4 categories, to attempt to enhance normal characteristics that improve well-being or autonomy. So, for example, enhancing low normal IQ. So this concept of expected harm, I've also written about in other areas, for example, embryo research, that we should prefer the research that minimizes expected harm. And in fact, it applies to all forms of risky research where there is a risk of serious morbidity or mortality. So, for example, challenge studies during the pandemic, I kind of somewhat lightheartedly suggested that the elderly might want to volunteer for challenge studies, because particularly if they had otherwise lethal conditions, this would be a kind of version of what I've also proposed before, of voluntary research euthanasia, where you can give up your life in lethal research at the end of life when you would otherwise die. But I won't discuss those sort of more controversial topics. But in fact, at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne, I understand they've employed this kind of translational pathway to rolling out gene therapy to extremely sick infants, starting with those who have the least to lose and the most to gain. So this is a recent paper where we've talked about the application of this principle to embryo research. I won't talk in this talk about the contribution of philosophy to understanding the concepts of coercion and exploitation, but through a proper conceptual analysis of these ideas, we've proposed higher payment for risky research, such as challenge studies, and incentives for vaccination. So again, the point of this is really just to show that philosophy can open up possibilities that otherwise seem to be closed. So in relationship to vaccination, we've described an algorithm for when vaccination should be or can be mandatory, but we've also described a reasonable approach to using incentives to influence behaviour rather than disincentives and coercion. But I want to return now to make some sort of stronger points around gene editing that again may be surprising to some of you. So it may not only be morally permissible to do gene editing in this translational way that I've described, there may be a moral imperative to gene edit embryos. So imagine that there's a pill which would cure cystic fibrosis. It would be wrong if parents refused to administer such a pill. And indeed, if the pill was free of side effects, doctors should seek a court order to administer the pill, just as doctors seek a court order to provide blood transfusions to children whose parents refuse on religious grounds. And the gene editing is just the ultimate cure for genetic disorders. It corrects the abnormality in every cell. I'm talking here about germline gene editing, not somatic gene editing. And so if germline gene editing were safe, doctors should seek court orders to gene edit, because it would be essentially a cure for a severe condition such as cystic fibrosis. And indeed, gene editing is in one way different to genetic selection. A future child could justifiably complain, you should have tried to cure my genetic disorder with gene editing. So there are actually much stronger reasons to consider gene editing, which is really just ultimate medicine for genetic disorders. But one of the objections you frequently hear in the literature is that there's no medical reason to manipulate the human germline because inherited genetic diseases can be prevented by embryo screening or genetic selection. So we don't need to modify embryos. We can produce multiple embryos and test them to, for example, see which one doesn't have cystic fibrosis and select that embryo rather than another. And this is much less risky than gene editing. So there's no medical reason in the case of single gene disorders to employ gene editing. But again, this is philosophically mistaken for a number of reasons. Firstly, sometimes there are limited numbers of embryos, particularly as people get older. Very occasionally, couples are homozygous for a genetic disorder, meaning all of their embryos will be affected. But particularly in countries like Malaysia, there may be religious or moral objections to genetic selection and embryo destruction. And in these cases, gene editing enables the creation of a single embryo with no embryo destruction and the potential to attempt to cure the disease in that single embryo. The worse the genetic disorder, the stronger the reason to attempt gene editing. But there's another reason to think that gene editing is more important than we realise. Most of the disorders that people will suffer from are polygenic. They have multiple genetic contributions. So I think this is an old slide. There are probably more genes involved in diabetes. Coronary artery disease has, over 35 genes involved. So with genetic selection, you only have a very limited ability to influence polygenic conditions. So, if there were 20 genes contributing to a trait, and you wanted to maximize or, reduce the risk maximally, you need around 10,000 embryos to make one sufficiently likely to have the right combination at all 20 loci. And that's simply not feasible unless we develop in vitro gametogenesis. But actually, with Peter Vischer at the University of Queensland at Lower Yengo, we've looked at the potential for polygenic editing to change the incidence of disease. So if the associations we currently have were to reflect true causal variance, or we could identify causal variance, in the case of Alzheimer's disease, modifying 23 genes could reduce the incidence of Alzheimer's disease from 5% to 0.3%. And, changing large numbers of genes, the ones which are currently thought to be associated, for type 2 diabetes, coronary artery disease, and schizophrenia would lead to negligible presence of those diseases amongst the edited genomes. There would also be massive changes to quantitative traits, such as IQ. It's estimated that if all of the genes associated with increase in IQ were causative, and you were able to modify all of them, you would add 75 IQ points, which is 5 standard deviations. So these changes are virtually impossible to achieve naturally, as I've already said. For example, the probability of being homozygous for all 10 loci that are associated with Alzheimer's disease is about 1 in 2 billion. So genetic selection is just not going to address the problem of polygenic disease. And I'm going to finish with this more philosophical consideration supporting gene editing. And that derives from what Derek Parfit has called the non-identity problem. So gene editing provides a person-affecting benefit that makes people's lives go better, rather than what we can call an impersonal benefit, a benefit that creates more health in the world, but doesn't make any individual better off than they would otherwise have been. So let me describe what the issue is here. So Parfit in 1984 described this case, the 14-year-old girl. This girl chooses to have a child because she is so young. She gives her child a bad start in life, but this will have bad effects throughout the child's life. His life will predictably be worth living. This girl had waited several years. She would have had a different child to whom she could have given a better start in life. Now, Parfit argues that she should wait to have a child who is going to have a better start in life. But this doesn't benefit that child. It simply replaces one child now with a different child later. So it's an impersonal benefit. And in fact, many people are attracted to the concept of providing benefits in this way. At the time of the Zika pandemic, Zika is a mosquito-borne disease that causes microcephaly and intellectual disability in fetuses affected during pregnancy. At the time of the Zika epidemic, Public Health England and the CDC both issued advice saying you should wait 3 months before attempting to conceive after visiting a region affected by Zika. So this is exactly like the case of the 14-year-old girl. They didn't say, you know, if you want to have a child who has less chance of microcephaly and intellectual disability, then wait 3 months. They said, you should wait 3 months. And failing to wait, importantly, doesn't harm that individual because it just changes who comes into existence. So the harm in this case is if there is a harm, an impersonal harm, a harm of bringing about less well-being or health in the world when we could have brought about more. And in fact, this is precisely the kind of harm which justifies obligations to future generations. So selection involves impersonal benefits. It involves replacing one individual with another individual who will have a better life. And I coined this term back in 2000, procreative beneficence, that couples should select the children of the possible children they could have, who is expected to have the best life based on the relevant available information. And in fact, the advice of Public Health England and the CDC are just instantiations of procreative beneficence, that you should have a child without intellectual disability if you can do so. And this has proved to be this is an old slide again. There's more than 1,000 citations, all of them negative, I think, towards procreative beneficence. But this has been proven to be my most controversial article, even though it's common sense and Public Health England and the CDC implicitly embrace it. Now, The implications of this idea of impersonal harm is that we have a moral obligation to select against severe diseases like microcephaly and severe intellectual disability, but also mild diseases. You have one embryo that is going to be afflicted with a mild condition like eczema, and the other one which is not, and in all other respects they're equal. You have a reason to select the embryo without the eczema. Or late onset diseases like Alzheimer's disease. There's a genetic disposition to Alzheimer's disease, as there clearly is. Then if you have embryos without those diseases, you should select those. It also, I provocatively argued, it extended beyond disease to well-being, to traits like impulse control that are correlated with higher levels of socioeconomic success, more friends, better academic performance, and greater life opportunities. So, if you have genes that are associated with impulse control, just as they're likely to be genes associated with intelligence, you can identify those. You have an obligation to select in favour of them if they're correlated with lives of greater well-being. And I recently published this paper on the regulation of polygenic testing of embryos based on this principle of promoting future well-being. So I won't go through this. I want to just finish with this puzzle that actually speaks in favour of gene editing rather than genetic selection based on the considerations of person affecting and impersonal benefit and harm. The opposite of gene editing and genetic selection to avoid disease is the employment of either genetic selection or biointerventions to create disability. So some people in the deaf community believe that deafness is just a difference and that its effects are mediated through social prejudice, and they seek to have a child like themselves by having IVF and testing embryos to select one which is not going to be hearing. So instead of using it to select a hearing embryo, they choose to select a deaf embryo. Around 5% of clinics in the US have received requests to select either a deaf or achondroplastic embryo that would give rise to short stature or dwarfism. Now, that involves selecting a deaf child. Another way of having a deaf child is to deafen a hearing embryo or child, for example, through gene editing or administering toxic drugs. So if you accept this argument that deafness is just a difference, like having different hair color, there would seem to be nothing problematic about deafening a child or embryo. A kind of more common way in which this is achieved is by denying children who are going to be deaf cochlear implants. This results in a child being deaf who could otherwise have been at least partially hearing. So if we think about these two different ways of having a deaf child, on the one hand, producing 10 embryos and then selecting an embryo, say, Danny, who is going to be deaf, versus having a hearing child, Harry, and deafening Harry, it seems to be much worse to actually deafen the child than it does to select an embryo that nature could otherwise have selected. And this seems to suggest that person-affecting reasons around whether someone is made better or worse off, are stronger than impersonal reasons related to genetic selection. So over 20 years ago, I argued it should be illegal to deafen children, but legally permissible to select a deaf embryo because it involves what's sometimes called harmless wrongdoing. Although it fails to promote as much benefit in the world, it doesn't harm Danny to be conceived. He's likely to have a life which is worth living. So in this way, person-affecting harm seems to be worse than an impersonal harm. So if you translate this to gene editing provides person-affecting benefits. So action and genetic selection does not benefit any person. It just changes who comes into existence. So if we think it's worse to deafen a child than it is to select a deaf embryo, we should logically think it's better to gene edit an embryo to cure a disorder than it is to select an embryo without that condition. So in this way, gene editing is actually superior in an important philosophical way to genetic selection. So I might stop there and not go on to designer babies, which is sort of even more kind of controversial. But the arguments for designer babies essentially, follow from a basic idea that genes don't just contribute to our health and our diseases. They also contribute to our talents, our abilities, and our capacities for well-being. And insofar as genes can affect our well-being, we have the same reason to modify them or select them as we do to treat or prevent disease. Because it's not disease or health which matter intrinsically, it's human well-being. But from the point of view of research, I think that I've tried to argue that there are important philosophical considerations for, first of all, more seriously considering germline gene editing of embryos, and secondly, to create a translational pathway based on minimizing expected harm that would enable a staged approach to embryo editing. So let me stop there and take some questions.
Thank you very much for that, Julian. Most interesting, and we already have quite a number of questions in the Q&A box. So I'll try and get through as many as possible, with the first one from Arthur Kopelman. If you prioritize the embryos with lethal conditions for gene editing, you'll be treating fetuses that would not have been implanted. If that's the case, their risk of research involvement would be the risk from the research plus the risk of being born with a lethal condition. Your thoughts on that?
This may or may not answer your question, but if we divide lives with severe genetic disorders into those which are worth living and those which are not worth living, I think it's correct that if you're choosing embryos that we think have lives which are for themselves not worth living and bringing them into existence with gene editing, we do risk harming those future children. So what might be examples of conditions which make life not worth living? Maybe Lesch-Nyhan disease or severe variants of epidermolysis bullosa. So if you did take embryos with those conditions and were able to gene edit them, then and brought to gestation, if the gene editing wasn't effective, it's correct that you would be harming those individuals. So it's true that maybe we don't want the very most severe conditions where we risk harming the individual by bringing them into existence. And we want those ones where if things didn't work out and they were brought into existence and had short lives, those lives would still, for them, be lives which are worth living. I mean, a parallel example is spinal muscular atrophy, one of the commonest genetic disorders. And there is now gene therapy for this called Zolgensma, I think. And it takes a lethal condition, and the worry is it converts it into an extremely severe condition that, so it doesn't completely cure it, it partially cures it, but enables an individual to live a life which will be full of suffering. And then the question becomes, are you doing more harm than good? Are you creating a life that's not worth living? So my point for this talk is these are philosophical questions. Medicine itself can't tell you what a life worth living is. It's something we have to decide using ethics and philosophy. Medicine, once we've set what it is, can tell us whether an individual crosses that threshold or doesn't cross that threshold. That's an empirical question. But the most profound and difficult questions are actually philosophical, that we have to work out for ourselves.
Yeah. Along those lines, another comment from Maria Maximova is, who would be responsible in case of fatal mistakes in these gene editing measures?
Well, I mean, in one way, gene editing is no different to any other medical intervention. It just operates at the kind of most fundamental level. So the kind of principles of ascription of responsibility would be the same as we use for any experimental treatment. And we would assign responsibility in the same way. So the producer of the gene therapy could be responsible if it was not created with due care and diligence. The person administering the gene therapy could be responsible if they again failed to inform the parents of the risks, and if they administered the gene therapy incompetently or negligently. Ethics committees might be responsible if they fail to, give adequate consideration to the ethical considerations. In the Gelsinger case, Art Kaplan, the sort of probably the most famous medical ethicist in the US, gave James Wilson advice to use adults who could consent with the mild version of the disorder. And he was correct. That's what the Declaration of Helsinki said. But he was sued by Gelsinger's father for providing that advice. That suit didn't succeed, but it shows that ethicists and ethics committees can potentially be liable for making mistakes. I don't think he should have been held responsible because he was following guidance from the World Medical Association. I think the World Medical Association probably should be sued for giving such sort of simplistic advice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The next one is, how should selection of therapy for social traits be regulated? Is market the answer, or should this be something that medical organizations decide, and what kind of regulations do we need?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and how it will be regulated is just really according to the market. So that's probably the reality. But what we proposed in that paper I quickly flashed up was what I call a welfarist approach to regulation. So rather than just, so there are three models of regulating genetic selection. One is the disease model, that you pick sufficiently severe diseases and you allow people to select against those. The other one is a laissez-faire model, which is what the US employs. You can basically select for anything. And what Sarah Munday and I argue for is you could set a threshold for improvements of well-being that make that form of selection permissible. So, for example, normal IQ ranges between 70 and 130. So if you have less than 70, you're said to have a disease, a disorder, intellectual disability. But having an IQ between 70 and 85, which about 15% of the population has, severely limiting today in today's complex world, severely restricting of job opportunities, even though it's normal. Technically, it's not a disease. And what we argue is that you could allow genetic selection against embryos that are predicted to have IQs between 70 and 85 on welfarist grounds. Now, whether you could extend that to choosing between embryos with a predicted IQ of 120 rather than 110 is another question. It may be that the answer is yes, but we need to look at the implications for well-being in order to answer that, is the sort of welfarist approach.
Yeah. Okay. There's one asking why Tay-Sachs disease and not sickle cell disease, which affects a lot of sub-Saharan children in sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, again, please correct. It's quite a long time since I studied sickle cell disease, but my understanding is that sickle cell disease, although it is associated with shortened lifespan and a lot of morbidity, is not as severe as something like Tay-Sachs disease. So sickle cell disease is typically not lethal in the first few months or years. Or is there if there is a severe variant that is lethal to that degree, yes, you're correct, you could do it for sickle cell disease. But the argument is that we should start with those conditions which are lethal in the first months or couple of years of life before we move on to diseases which are lethal, in the first 10 or 20 years of life. And I'm not familiar with the variants of sickle cell disease to know exactly which one it fits into. But if it is severe enough, yes, you could start with it. It certainly is a candidate for gene editing. It's just that, once the disease, once the life has more potential for well-being, we have to be more confident in the safety of the gene editing. And the problem with He Jian Kuei is that he didn't calibrate his approach to patient selection according to what we know about safety. So, he made a fundamental ethical mistake.
Joe, do you want to take
Sure,
over?
yeah. I actually had a quick question, if I could interject and ask maybe about your thoughts on the subject of harm, and whether in your thinking about this topic, if it's mainly about the future child, or if there are others that might be considered in that framework of potential harm or risk. So like thinking of caregivers or parents or others who might, experience greater burden or something in those early months or years of life if things don't go well or whatever it might be. But anyway, just thinking about how where the locus of risk and harm is in your reasoning. Yeah,
one of the standard principle of medical ethics is to employ interventions in the best interest of the child. You're meant to ignore all the considerations around the family or society and just focus on the single individual. So that's the basic principle. But, some people like my colleague Dominic Wilkinson have argued that we ought to take into account to some degree the interests of parents, not just their desires, but whether they're benefited or harmed. In the past, eugenicists have taken into account the so-called effects on society. So I'm myself inclined to focus just on the child. I think it keeps it simpler. But there are arguments to consider the sort of impact on parents. So I mean, we did a survey of women who had non-invasive prenatal testing, for a kind of honours science project, and we asked women who had this, what other conditions do you think we should do NIPT for? And one of the conditions that we asked about was antisocial personality. And, parents weren't particularly interested in selecting for IQ, but they were really interested in selecting against an antisocial personality, a child with behavioural abnormalities. And I think parents, with children with callous unemotional personality are really distraught by the moral behaviour of their children. And I think this is a case where, moral enhancement or moral selection could be justified both for parents and society. So one of the most highly heritable non-disease traits, I don't think it's a disease, is psychopathy. So if you can select between embryos that have a high risk of psychopathy, it's highly heritable, and embryos with a lower risk, I think you should select against psychopathy, both for the benefit of the parents and the benefit of wider society. Now, where do you draw the line? Again, ethics is all about drawing lines like speed limits. And, there's going to be a complicated issue about, well, okay, maybe psychopathy, but, how far do we go? But I think in principle, moral selection or moral bioenhancement, are not only permissible, but we should do them.
I'll raise another question here from Colleen Higgins. It's about sort of selecting against conditions that maybe have complicated implications for protective factors that are also related to those conditions. So she gives an example of sickle cell. When an allele is in the heterozygous state, might provide an advantage such as resistance to malaria, particularly when we don't know the importance of the heterozygous state of many genes. So, if you were to eliminate, in theory, right, sickle cell disease, I'm not sure if that'd be possible through gene editing, but if that were possible, whether you have thoughts on that sort of,
Yeah, so one of the arguments against, both selection and genetic treatment is reduction in diversity. So, you mentioned the sort of sickle cell variant, but, the cystic fibrosis variant, reduces, risk from diarrheal illnesses. And so people say, well, and when the next pandemic comes, if we narrow the gene pool, we may not be resistant to, that we may not have the resistant few who will be able to withstand the pandemic. And kind of my response to that is that may have been true, through the past in human history, but it's not how we deal with diseases today. We don't wait for this very tiny number of people who are immune to HIV to repopulate the species. We develop preventions and treatments and education and social programs and medicines and so on to deal with HIV. We don't wait for genetic diversity to sort of do its thing. And indeed, with gene editing, you could introduce massive genetic diversity. So I think it's in that formulation as being necessary for our survival. I think it isn't very persuasive. Another related problem, though, is pleiotropy. Genes can be beneficial in one environment or can have multiple effects. So actually, researchers using the 100,000 genomes in the UK developed a polygenic risk score for same-sex behaviour that was able to predict whether people would engage in same-sex behaviour. But the genes, the people who are high on the score for same-sex behaviour were also high on openness to experience, risk-taking, so a number of other actually valuable traits. So one of the issues that comes up when you move out of sort of genetic disease to non-disease traits is this problem of pleiotropy, the multiple effects. And again, you need to think about this, you need to think about selection differently to enhancement. If you're worried about pleiotropy, selection has less risks because you're just selecting an embryo that wouldn't otherwise go on to produce a baby, and you're enabling an individual to come into existence. So if that individual has a genetic disposition to creativity, but it also is a disposition to manic depression, they can't complain and say, oh, you should have selected a different embryo because that would have been a different person. Whereas if you decide to gene edit creativity and you also increase the risk of manic depression, the individual can complain and say, you made a mistake in trying to modify me. The burdens have outweighed the benefits. So in that case, in the case of pleiotropy, selection may be preferable to enhancement or intervention.
Great, thank you. I'm taking questions a little bit out of order, just to mix up the topics a bit, but we have a question here from Lai Manglui, who's a longtime ethics committee leader and chair and member in Malaysia. And so perhaps unsurprisingly asking a question about ethics committees and their struggle all the time with philosophical questions. What should be the threshold of disability, that risks of experiments become not worth taking, etc. And usually falling back on community views or consensus or what reasonable people are conceived to be interested in, and not sort of maybe in her words, denying individual choices of life worth living or risks worth taking. So you have thoughts on sort of how this could
I
maybe
mean,
be upwards?
again, this is a case where you have to draw lines and there's going to be controversy. So the way of dealing with these difficult cases is generally to let individuals decide for themselves. So if you're talking about competent adults, I'm very much in favor of enabling that individual to make a decision about whether they want to take the risky experimental treatment or not the ethics committee, because it's often just not clear. So, I think we should empower, adult patients to make their own decisions about whether the risks are worth it, or whether the life is tolerable or not. When it comes to children and embryos, they can't make that decision for themselves. So people tend to say, well, the parents should make the decision. But we take a more paternalistic stance when it comes to children. And my colleague Lynn Gillam in Australia has described this zone of parental discretion where, in a grey zone where we think it's, it might be reasonable, we let parents decide. But if it's obviously in the child's interests, then we should do it. If it's obviously not in the child's interest, we shouldn't do it. So then the question is, are we in the zone of parental discretion? Now, you mentioned consensus. Again, in the case of children, Dominic Wilkinson and I have coined this term dissensus. So we argue that you don't need to get consensus because, or in fact, consensus is not desirable when you're in highly contested ground. What you want is dissensus. You want if there is a reasonable voice or a reasonable minority that have good reasons for their position that align with what the parents want, then you ought to go with what the parents want in these contested cases involving children. I've talked about the case of Charlie Gard, who was denied the ability to move to America to access experimental treatment and died as a result of that in the UK because the court said it was in his best interest to die. But I think, there was a very credible dissensus on the part of the American Dr. Michio Hirano, who was prepared to offer that opportunity. And I think in that case, we should have gone with the experimental treatment.
Thanks. We might have time for just one more question here. There's a bit of a suggestion of maybe a correction on the Zolgensma, babies with SMA identified by newborn screening. Now 98+% of babies born in the US are being treated in most cases pre-symptomatically or very early symptoms, in most cases developing normally. This is true for 2 other approved drugs for SMA. Maybe just take note of that. I'll just move.
Is that type 1 SMA? So anyway,
okay.
That's fine. Yeah. I stand corrected.
And then I guess take maybe the last comment here, the first one on our list from Constantine says, thank you. And thanks so much for a very thought-provoking presentation and work you've published. I guess asking about movements against ableist arguments to what is morally appropriate in ethics of human subjects research. So maybe if you'd like to say a little bit more about how ableism does or doesn't intersect with the line of reasoning that you've shared.
Well, so it's very tricky. So, for example, members of the neurodiversity, Dominic Wilkinson and I were asked to write a piece on autism spectrum disorders, and we wrote a piece on selection and intervention and so on. And actually, the editor in the end rejected it because some members of the neurodiversity community say we shouldn't be doing this kind of research into the genetics of neurodiversity because it's not a disorder, and this is ableist. So there are moves to contest that what have traditionally been thought to be diseases or disorders affecting people's well-being, like Down syndrome or autism or deafness, actually have a necessary connection with decrements in well-being, and that actually the badness of those conditions is because of the way in which society is constructed. So I've again coined a new concept of disability, which is not the social model, it's not the medical model, it's the welfarist model. And, you know, I've argued that something is a disability if it tends to reduce our well-being in a given social or natural circumstance. So when it comes to conditions like deafness, I think, you know, I agree that much of the badness of deafness is socially constructed. In fact, I've written a paper arguing we should teach children in primary school sign language as their second language rather than, say, Chinese, which is what's taught here in Singapore. So I agree that there is a lot of ableism in the sense that the harms are socially constructed. But I also depart from the social model in that I don't think that all of the disadvantages associated with so-called disabilities are purely socially constructed. So to take the example of Down syndrome, some of the harm that's caused is socially constructed, but some of it, I think, is inherent to having intellectual impairment, and that can't be corrected purely through social interventions. Now, that's a controversial claim. Some people will say it depends on what your concept of well-being is, and that's a philosophical question. And again, there are two broad ways of thinking about well-being: subjective well-being, which is the way we feel about our own lives, our own happiness or satisfaction with them. So on those models, it may be more plausible that there is a lot of ableism when it comes to the so-called disabilities. On more objective accounts of well-being, there may be ways in which those lives are more limited than others. So, for example, the capacity and nature of the social relationships that they can enjoy, their ability to achieve things in the world, and so on. So, again, our answers depend on philosophy, not so much on the medical or scientific facts.
I think on that, we'll have to end for today, and just thank Professor Savulescu again for joining us and giving a really thought-provoking talk as usual, I think. Obviously, lots of questions. I'm glad we were able to get to many of them. Sorry if we weren't able to get to yours. But again, the recording will be posted for anyone who's interested in sharing with others. So thanks again. There'll be an exit survey as you click out of the Zoom webinar. If you have a moment to take that, please do. Thank you.
Thanks for the thoughtful questions. They're very good.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you.
Good night,
Good night.
everyone.